Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second online Academy of Faith and Generosity webinar. My name is Kim Matthews. I'm the Vice President of the United Methodist Foundation of West Virginia. One technical detail before we start, this is a webinar. You can see the panelists and hear them, but we can't see you or hear you, just so you're aware and you're not wondering if we can see you. But if you do have a question during the webinar, there is a chat function and a Q&A. You can use either one of those, and I'll be monitoring those and ask those questions of our presenters as we go. Our presenters this evening are Lovett Weems and Ann Michael. They recently published a book called Generosity, Stewardship and Abundance, a Transformational Guide to Church Finance. Jeff's holding it up. Everyone, it should be familiar to you because if you registered for the event, you received the book. If you haven't received it yet, all of them have been sent out, so it should be in your hands soon. I want to start by introducing our panelists. Dr. Ann Michael has served on the staff of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership since 2005. She currently serves as co-editor of the Lewis Center's online newsletter, Leading Ideas. If you don't subscribe to that, you should do that. It's wonderful. She also serves as an adjunct member of the faculty of Wesley Theological Seminary, teaching in the areas of leadership and stewardship. She has a master's of theological studies and is a doctor of ministry and church leadership, and both degrees are from Wesley Theological Seminary. Dr. Lovett Weems is the Wesley Seminary Distinguished Professor of Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary, and he's founding director and senior consultant at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. He has a master's of theology from SMU and a doctorate of ministry from Wesley. Both Ann and Lovett are authors of numerous publications that you should check out. Jeff Taylor is the president of the United Methodist Foundation, serving in that role for more than 14 years. He's been a member of the foundation staff since 2003. Jeff is an attorney and an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church. His law degree is from WVU, and his theological education is from Methesco Theological School in Ohio. Remember to use the chat if you have questions. I'll be watching that. Depending on the topic, we'll add those questions during the presentation or at the end. We'll get those questions answered. So I'm going to turn off my camera and turn it over to our presenters. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to Ann and Lovett for coming to almost heaven in this virtual way. We're glad to have you with us tonight. And as Kim said, our participants have read the book cover to cover, perhaps, or maybe they're just getting started. And some of our participants are in a group book study with Kim and me. And we've had 2 sessions so far and lots of robust discussion, which I think we'll get some of that tonight. And I want to just start by asking, early on in the book, you address what you refer to as a conspiracy of silence around money. And I think many of us can relate to that in our congregations. So I just wonder if you can address that and perhaps suggest some strategies for more effective conversation around money and giving.
Speak to that. Yes, this conspiracy of silence was described by a group of researchers after they'd spent a lot of time talking with pastors and lay people about money in the church. And the conspiracy of silence goes this way. Many clergy, perhaps most, are very uncomfortable talking about money. And lay people are very happy for them not to talk about money. So with a wink and a nod, we just don't talk about money in the church, except when we have to. But it will help if we can come up with some fresh ways to think about it. And there are 2 principles that we talk about when talking about money. The first is never talk about people's money apart from discipleship. The people's need to give is far greater than the church's need to receive. Someone in one church said, When people are new in the church, we don't expect them to give much. That's not where they are. They're not spiritually ready for that. But we do expect, as they grow in their spiritual life, they will continue to grow in their giving. And so we encourage that, just as we encourage prayer and Bible study and worship attendance and all those other things that go into the life of discipleship. So if we start talking about people's money without connecting it to discipleship, that gets to be an awkward conversation very soon. But if we keep it connected to discipleship, then all we're doing is exactly what anyone in the church would expect us to do, looking after the souls and the spiritual welfare of people. The second principle is this: never talk about the church's money apart from mission. You always want to connect any talk of money that's connected to your church with the church's mission. Otherwise, you have no reason for the money and you have no reason to talk about it. And often it depends on pastors and other church leaders to always make that connection. Sometimes we'll fall into talking about things like inflation or utility bills or some unexpected expense without putting that in a larger picture. We're not in the utility business. We're in the God business. We have to connect whatever we're talking about to the reason we exist. And it can be a simple connection. It can be done quickly. But unless we do it, people may think we're talking about utilities, or they may think we're talking about something else, when in reality, we've got no business talking about anything unless we can connect it to our mission and people can see that it's important based on that mission. So these are at least two principles or guidelines that may help you have a new and what people may experience as a fresh way of thinking about money, and give you a little more confidence and comfort in talking about the subject yourself.
Well, let's say, imagine I'm in a finance committee meeting and I've got a spreadsheet that's in about 6 or 7 point font. I have to take my glasses off and pull it way up to see it. How can you give me some examples of how I might make a connection in that setting to the mission of the church when everyone is kind of focused on that spreadsheet and perhaps the bottom line?
Yes. Well, I would begin myself by saying, I am so proud to be the pastor of a church who has people who can not only understand spreadsheets, but are willing to come and give time every month on it. And there are certain things you're looking for. You're wanting to make sure that people are staying within the budget that's been approved. You're wanting to make sure that there's going to be enough income to cover the expenses. You're wanting to make sure that things are spent the way they're supposed to be spent. But I know that the reason you're here tonight and the only reason you give your time is not about spreadsheets. It's not about accounting principles. As much as important as these are, it's about the children who are going to come into our church on Sunday morning.
Yes.
It's about the elderly. It's about every person who comes under the influence of this church, that they come to know the abundant life that God has for everyone. And so on behalf of the whole church, I want to say thank you, because behind all these numbers are people and lives that are being touched. And I know that although your conversations will have to be about decimals, that in your heart, that's where the motivation is for what you're doing. And the entire congregation says thank you for it.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of makes me want to get that spreadsheet out. I really do appreciate that example. And too often we forget, I think, with leaders in the church forget to make that connection. So I really appreciate your stressing how important that is and giving us an example that we can actually put to use. There's a phrase that comes up time and time again in your book, and we actually use this in our mission statement at the foundation, and that's a culture of generosity. Can you tell us what that looks like and how it comes about?
I can address that question, Jeff. So those of you who have read the book or are beginning to read it know that the first section of the book is built around the principle of generosity, the doctrine of generosity, and the idea that God is generous and we're called to be generous as God is generous. The problem is that we all live in a broader culture that really believes just the opposite, that what we're supposed to be all about is acquiring everything that we can rather than sharing everything that we can. And so we're always having to invite people into an alternate culture, an alternate mindset, an alternate worldview, and thinking about money and giving and generosity when they step into the church. And you know, with my students at the seminary, when I talk with them about how we can form people, invite them to step into a different way of thinking about generosity and giving and money, the first things that they always want to talk about is preaching and Bible studies. I'll do a sermon series or I'll lead a Bible study. And, you know, preaching and teaching are a very important part of how we form people in the church. But I have come to understand that generosity is more often caught than taught, that there is something about the idea of just creating a whole different way of thinking that is suffused throughout the culture of the church. It's not just something that gets preached about. It's not just something that we read about in Bible studies, but it's something that gets talked about in the day-to-day life of the church. And so building a culture of generosity is about finding ways to weave the vocabulary of giving and gratitude and generosity into your prayer life, into your liturgies, in the hymns that you choose, not just on Sunday mornings, but all the times that the church gathers, just really exercising that vocabulary and using what goes on in the day-to-day life of the church to weave those things in. And I think it relates to the idea of the conspiracy of silence. You know, we don't do that because we don't like to talk about money. So we have to make a deliberate effort to use we have a wonderful story to tell about a generous God and the things that generosity makes possible. And so just finding ways to share the stories, to use the vocabulary, to use the offering time on Sunday morning, the way that we talk with our children, just thinking of all of the ways. I challenge my students to just think of clever ways that you can weave this subject into what's going on in your church. And I think that's how you start to influence the whole culture, just by sort of weaving it into the warp and the weft of congregational life.
Thank you. And you mentioned the vocabulary. And I noticed that when Lovett gave that example for me of a connection between the church money and the mission of the church, he began with gratitude. He thanked me for being on the finance committee, and he ended with gratitude.
Mhm.
And in your book, you talk a lot about gratitude, and you say that gratitude and generosity are two sides of the same coin. And
Yeah.
is that part of what you're talking about in this culture, creating
Yes.
culture?
Absolutely, because part of creating that culture of generosity is emphasizing a spirit of gratitude, because it's out of a sense of gratitude for what God has given us,
Yeah.
that we develop the capacity to be generous, and I mean, that's part of our life as the church,
Yeah.
giving thanks to God, and so I think it's very natural. It's a very natural starting point for us to then connect that to our call to be generous.
And it's also the motivation for the gratitude is the motivation for discipleship in general. So again, you can't think about generosity of an individual apart from discipleship. It's beginning to click for me, and maybe some others too. Can you share some ways to make it easier for people to give?
Well, out of the experience of the pandemic, many of the folks participating tonight may be saying, I don't want to think about all these alternate ways of giving again, because we've had to learn far more than we ever wanted to learn about electronic giving and other kinds of things. But I'd like to just take a moment to encourage you not to think about these things that we may have hastily put together during the pandemic as temporary things, but to begin thinking more broadly about how we have many opportunities for people to contribute to the commonwealth of our congregation, knowing that all those funds, whenever or however they're received, will be used to fulfill our mission. In some ways, it would be like a movie comes out, but it's only offered at one time, one day of the week. And in some of our churches, that's the way things were before the pandemic. You contributed when the offering plate came around. And so, but there are a number of things that have changed that cause us to need to rethink that. But here's one way to begin that rethinking, because you already have the building blocks in place, probably out of the pandemic experience. Think about if you were creating a brochure, or it may be a page on your website, and the title is Ways You Can Give to God's Work Through Our Congregation. And so you begin listing there, and you say, number one, the offering and worship. At each of our services, we have an opportunity for people to give. Then number two might be by mail. Mail your contribution to this address. And then you start thinking, what's number 3, 4, and 5, and 6 going to be? And so you think about some things perhaps that you put in place either during the pandemic, or maybe things you've had for a long time. It may be some kind of automated withdrawal system from a local bank, or a pay bills function through your bank, or something else like that. Or it might be online giving through a link on your website. It could be a number of other things. We list 7 or 8 things in our book. But keep in mind, what you're talking about here is not doing something because other churches are doing it. You're not talking about technology. You're only talking about your mission. If this is not done to enhance and support your mission, you don't need to be doing it. So don't let people get confused that you're talking about some new thing or you're talking about a technology thing. No, you're talking about what you always talk about. That's our mission and how we can better support it. And you're able to say, some of you have said, I don't write as many checks as I used to. You see, before the pandemic, 9 out of 10 churches were getting 90% or more of their funds in cash or checks. Now just think about that. 90% from cash or checks. The high point for check writing was 1994. Many people before the pandemic, when they wrote their check for the church, it was the only check they wrote all week.
Yeah.
So why would that matter? Well, there was a time when the church didn't take checks. It only took cash. And we could do that today. But why would we? You see? You're getting 90% of your money through cash and checks, and no more than 50% of financial transactions involve cash and checks anymore. So it's not so much that you're going after the latest technology. You're trying to have people use the way they handle their finances to be able to use some of those same things for the church. Now, another factor to keep in mind is that beginning in 2002, there's been a decline in church attendance across the United States every year since 2002. And it's not because so many people are just deserting the church. What we've discovered is that in a typical month, about the same number of people show up at church. But the number coming each week has been going down. The weekly average, that is, the same people are attending, but they tend to attend less frequently. So if the only time you're expecting to receive funds are when worship services are going, that's a problem. Now, are we separating giving from worship? Well, in a way we are, but in another way we aren't. You see, before the pandemic, many people were paying their pledge once a month. But when the offering plate would come around, they would put something in the offering plate because they knew that children and youth were watching and they wanted to make a good example. And that's why many churches now will have printed cards that say, I've given electronically, or I've given earlier in the week. Now, with all of this, the thing that you can do that's most supportive of these alternate ways of giving is that when you have the prayer in the worship service for the offering collected there, you want to give thanks for all the gifts that have been given this week. Those in the offering plate, those who have given electronically, those who have mailed their gifts. For all these, we lift them up and give thanks. That's a way of supporting. You do need to give something to people that they can put in that offering plate when it comes by, because what I'm noticing in different churches is that when the offering plate's going around now, with so many people have moved to giving in other ways, that it gives the appearance that no one gives. So that symbolism is important as an act of worship. But when the money arrives, you're better off letting that come based on making it easier for people and how they do their lives, their financial lives.
That reminds me, Lovett, of a story. We talked before the participants joined in about your having been at a seminar or conference I was at in Kansas City. And I recall you telling a story, and I've borrowed that story and probably embellished it, but that you were visiting a church, you didn't have any cash, they didn't have any way to take a credit card gift. So you thought, well, I'll write a check, and then they only had a pencil in the pew.
That's right.
So that's sort of a pre-pandemic look at the way churches sometimes fail to make it easy to give. And so that's a good segue into another question. I don't want to get too.
Jeff, can I interrupt you first?
Yeah,
I have a
please
good
do.
question here that goes right along with this. What will giving and stewardship be like going forward? In your book, you mentioned that it is vital for churches who practice good stewardship to offer some sort of electronic giving option to make giving more accessible. Do you see a day where passing the offering plate will become obsolete?
Well, how the offering is done has varied over the centuries. And so there may be ways that is different. For example, a lot of churches use offering envelopes. Those really didn't come in till like the 1920s, 1930s. It was very controversial in churches. Churches had big fights about whether they would use offering envelopes or not. So we know what we are accustomed to. No, I think the offering is just like in some churches, they bring the offering to the front. In some churches, they take it. During the pandemic, some people got in to just put the plate at the back or somewhere if somebody wanted to give it. I think that's a sure way to not get any money. But I think it will continue in some way. But what it looks like and how we do it, when people were so afraid of touching plates
Right.
and all, I said, get some baskets, give them to some children, and let them walk down the aisle and let people go over and drop it in the baskets. They don't have to touch anybody, and they'll be falling all over themselves to be able to put something in the basket. So you've got to be creative sometimes in that. But I think in one way or the other, yes, it will continue, obviously.
Yeah, and it should continue because, Lovett's right that it doesn't matter whether you pass the plate or whether you invite people to bring their offering forward or whether you have those poles that, slide the sacks down the pew. But whatever the way that people deposit their offerings, offering is an essential part of worship. It's an act of worship. And we have this wonderful opportunity that very few other organizations have to, invite our people to give face-to-face every Sunday and explain the importance of it to them. And we should not forego that. Developing more passive ways of taking an offering, just having a box at the back that people can drop their gift in. Lovett's right. That's a sure invitation that people are going to give less because you're not explaining to them why they should give and you're not systematically asking them to give. And that's a dead end street. So we have to keep the offering as an essential part of worship for both practical and theological reasons.
Thanks for that question, Andrew. That was a great question. I wanted to ask if we talked about some of the things to make it easier to give. Are there some common practices around churches that might impede a culture of generosity?
You know, there are so many that it's hard to know where to start. I mean, we've already talked about this problem of the conspiracy of silence around money. That's a big one, but I can name a couple others as well. You know, I think one of the obvious things to mention is that, you know, so many churches will sort of think about stewardship as something that you focus on just at one particular time a year, or maybe even just one Sunday a year. And they put, you know, they kind of hold their nose and make themselves talk about stewardship then. And then when that's over, they, you know, say, phew, we don't have to talk about this again until next year.
And just give me fair warning so I can stay home that Sunday.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's one of the things that's really problematic when we have one intensive focus on stewardship, but then don't say anything about it again until we come back around to that same time of year. I think another real problem is that we tend to sort of have this one size fits all approach anytime we're talking about giving. You know, there's one message that's a kind of a blanket message that goes out to everybody in the congregation. And that really ignores the fact that within every congregation, there are people that are all along the spectrum in terms of their understanding of why to give and in terms of their own development of generosity and discipleship. And so, you know, a message that may make total sense to somebody who's been in your church for decades and is a sacrificial giver or a tither isn't going to make a lot of sense to somebody who's just beginning that journey of generosity. And this is a challenging thing to do because it means we have to be a little bit more nuanced and multivocal in how we talk about money. But I think it's very essential because otherwise our messages are just going to be missing people. So I sometimes tell people to stop talking about stewardship. And that seems kind of counterintuitive since I teach stewardship. But, you know, I think so often the conversation around money in churches rests very heavily on tithing and stewardship, which are concepts that a lot of people, you know, who maybe are newer to the faith or aren't really steeped in biblical knowledge, just probably don't understand. And they come across as very legalistic. And so, you know, when I was talking earlier about building a culture of generosity, I think that is a shift in vocabulary, getting away from sort of that opening conversation being around tithing and stewardship, which people don't understand very well, and starting to talk more just about what it means to be generous, because you know everybody understands what generosity is about, and everybody has experienced God's generosity. And so, yeah, stop talking so much about stewardship. Let's put the conversation around generosity because it's a more gracious and understandable and easy starting point for people. So yeah, I think those are some of the traps that we're in, and some of the ways we can get out of them.
I grieve about it, but I do think stewardship is a perfectly good word that's developed a kind of a negative connotation that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Be nice.
Yeah, poor stewardship and evangelism. They're not very popular, are they? the two dirty words in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet it's such a good word.
Right. And so we don't ignore it. I mean, it's still a very important part of our theology.
Sure.
It's probably just not the first word that we speak to people as we're beginning a conversation.
Well, what are some ways we can invite people to give in more meaningful and effective ways.
Yeah, so I think here, I said a minute ago the idea that one size doesn't fit all. And so I think in order to encourage people to be more generous, we have to think a little bit more seriously about what people's different motivations are to give. And Lovett, in what he has been talking about this evening, has really stressed how important it is to emphasize the church's mission. And often it's not obvious to someone who's newer in the church where the money goes or how it's used. And so, part of that is telling the story in the ways that Lovett has talked about, always making that connection between money and mission. But I also have discovered that first-time givers and newer givers really often they're not as motivated to give to support institutional needs. And so sometimes the first way that someone will learn to give is through some kind of special giving opportunity where it's very clear where the money's going to go. So they might make a gift to support a mission trip, or to support Vacation Bible School, or to support buying new hymnals, because it's very clear to them what the need is. Now, we can't finance our churches only on special appeals. We all know that. But I do think that some of those special giving opportunities, if they're used strategically to help engage people who aren't yet motivated to give in a more regular fashion to support the ongoing budget of the church. And then the trick is to, once someone makes those first gifts, to make sure that they're thanked and encouraged. I think the other thing that really makes giving to the church most meaningful for people is their participation in the church. There's very clear evidence that the more active someone is in the church, the more they give. And that's not always intuitive to people. I can remember somebody saying to me, gosh, how come you give so much money to your church when you give so much time? And I was like, well, that's not how it works. It's not an either or. And in fact, the people who give the most time also give the most money. And so finding ways to get people more involved will lead them to become more generous givers. But that often is a very personal thing. So really getting to know people and what their interests are and what motivates them, and then connecting them with the activities, and they'll begin to then understand why giving to the church is important.
They become invested in it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's good. Can you share anything that might be different now because of the pandemic and going forward?
Yeah, well, my guess is that everybody who's on this webinar could tell us a thing or two about what's different because of the pandemic, because obviously so much has changed in so many aspects of the life of the church. And I think in some ways we're still just sort of taking stock and learning. And the good news is there's beginning to be some research available that's actually shedding light on what's been going on with churches, particularly in terms of their finances. And it's mixed. Some churches have held on pretty well during the pandemic. Others, of course, that's not the case. But some of the financial indicators are somewhat surprisingly positive. And so there's actually some good news that the pandemic may not have had as negative effect on generosity as we might have feared. So that's one thing that we're still learning. But there are at least some positive signs that it hasn't hurt generosity as much as we might have feared. Clearly, the move to electronic giving has been significant and I think hopeful I mean, it's really wonderful that it's encouraged so many churches to more fully embrace electronic giving. I think as a result of the pandemic too, churches are going to be looking a little bit more comprehensively at their economic sustainability. There are a lot of churches, reassessing their space needs, reassessing their staffing, and thinking about maybe some different ways of both how they use and how they might raise revenue. We've talked about differences in how churches are taking the offering. And I think that's something that in my church, we're still having that conversation about whether we should be passing the plates or not. I don't know if that's going on in some of your churches, but I think changes in our worship practices around offering is probably one thing. But at the end of the day, I think the most significant thing that we need to be concerned about coming out of the pandemic is something that Lovett has already mentioned, which is changes in attendance patterns. There was just research that came out on how churches have what's happening with attendance as a result of the pandemic. And what was found as of March of 2022, so that's just, this past March, just a couple of weeks ago, 90% of churches had reopened, but only 67% of people who are considered sort of regular worshipers in that they worship at least once a month, only 67% of them had actually come back to church services. And that's if that doesn't start to change, if attendance doesn't start to regularize, I think that's a big challenge for our whole giving paradigm, because we tend to wait till somebody comes to church to ask them to give. And the only time we tend to ask people to give is when they're sitting in the pews. And if we only have 2/3 as many people sitting in the pews on a given Sunday morning, that's a challenge for our giving systems. So I think as a result of this pandemic experience and the possible long-term effects on attendance, churches are going to have to learn how to ask people to give when they're not sitting in church. And that's something that we haven't developed that capacity yet. But there are ways to do it. Every other charity on the earth knows how to ask people to give when they're not sitting in front of them.
Right.
And so we may have to develop some of those skills.
We can assume that some of those people are at home watching on the live stream or Facebook Live. So we want to make sure that we're incorporating in worship those people and inviting them to give online or however they can give. So even if they're not sitting right in the pew, they're still there in front of us, just like you're in Almost Heaven, West Virginia, virtually.
Yeah, another thing to think about is that putting together your budget is going to be very important, because it's one thing to raise the money, but you're usually raising it in connection with a budget that's been approved. And so during the pandemic, some churches discovered things they could live without. But they've also discovered some areas where they may need more staffing or more attention or more equipment or things like that. So you want to take account of some of these new realities as you try to put the budget together. I mean, here's one way to think about it. Is it easier to find $1,000 that you can reduce from the budget, or to find a new donor for $1,000? Each can accomplish the same goal. Well, there's got to be kind of a balance in that, but you don't want to set things where failure is almost a guarantee. And with the attendance not being fully back, again, as with attendance or with money, you want to stay positive, and assume that everybody has the best of intentions, and acknowledge that some are still not comfortable with getting out, and that some in the congregation have special health challenges, and we want to affirm and support everyone, and pay attention to those that aren't coming back. You want to know that you're supportive of them, but pay attention to folks that aren't giving, and try to figure out what's going on there. And I think of paying attention as a spiritual discipline. Pay attention to who's there, pay attention to who's not there, pay attention to who's giving, pay attention to who's not giving, pay attention to who's giving for the first time, so that can be acknowledged and thanked. Pay attention to the visitor who makes a gift that needs to be acknowledged.
That brings me to a follow-up question, going back to this early section of the book about the conspiracy of silence. And you address there directly your belief that the pastor, the leader, needs to know the giving patterns of the church. And in our little small group book study, there was really some pushback against that. And I've been in settings around our annual conference where I know there's a widespread thought that the pastor should not know. And I agree wholeheartedly with the two of you that the pastor does need to know. But I wonder if you just address that for maybe those who haven't started reading the book yet.
Well, I'm not surprised that it's something that's come up in conversation in your book study, because believe me, every group that we ever talk with too, there's really, mixed feelings about this, and a lot of pastors are not comfortable. They don't want to know.
Mhm.
And there's been recent research suggesting that even in congregations where the pastors have, it's affirmed that the pastors have the right to know, they choose to shield themselves. They don't want to know. But there are really good spiritual and developmental reasons why it's important for a pastor to pay attention to what people are giving. It's giving is one sign of someone's spiritual maturity and their growth and discipleship. And it's important to pay attention to that, just like it's important to pay attention to whether someone's coming to worship or someone's participating in service, or, coming to Bible study, and, paying attention to their pastoral needs. Often giving can be a sign of a pastoral concern. If someone's
Sure.
giving drops off unexpectedly, it may be because of illness or unemployment or some other pastoral problem that you would want to be aware of. So I think there's a concern. A lot of pastors who tell me they don't want to know are afraid of favoritism. But I don't think at the end of the day, a good pastor does play favorites based on money any more than they would play favorites based on, any other way in which someone is engaging in the church. And so, the denomination actually has now, as of a couple of years ago, it's in the book of discipline that pastors should know, but that doesn't necessarily make it different within the local church. And so I'm not surprised that you're getting pushback on it, but it really is a matter of spiritual and developmental awareness, paying attention as a spiritual issue, as Lovett says. Do you want to jump in on that too, Lovett?
Well, no, I mean, clergy fall about 50-50, whether they think they should or not. And it's not something that I wouldn't take the discipline in and insist if the culture doesn't support it. There's a lot of information that you can ask of the person who does know. And we mentioned some of that in the book that will get you a long way toward knowing more. But just think about it. I mean, pastors know how frequently people attend worship.
Right.
But I don't think they use that to judge whether they give them pastoral care or anything like that. Nelson Searcy says you ought to pay attention to the top 10% of everybody in the congregation. That is, the top 10% of your givers, the top 10% of the people who have the strongest prayer life, the top 10% of the people who give themselves in hands-on mission, the top 10% of kind of the Bible students in your church, that you can learn from them, be in touch with them all the time. How did you get here? What led you to this? What would help others grow in this dimension? You know, there's not much ignorance about our members that make us better pastors. So whatever knowledge we have, we want to use it well,
Right.
sensitively, and only with the purest of motives.
Right. And you know, I'm not a pastor, but someone who is a pastor once said that, you know, there is so much personal information that pastors are privy to.
Right.
I mean, pastors often know about people's marital struggles and personal problems and health matters and all kinds of personal information. And pastors treat that, you know, appropriately. And so why would money be different? I think it's different because we've got hangups about money. But we need to learn to set that aside in order to minister to people effectively.
Thank you.
I do have a question from our audience. How vital is it for someone other than just the pastor to promote good stewardship in worship and in the life of the church?
That is such a good question. I think that's it is vital that someone other than just the pastor pay attention. Now, I don't want to let pastors off the hook by saying that. Pastors have an important role to play in encouraging generosity and giving. But if it's only the pastor's job, that's equally a problem, because you know, one of the reasons that pastors don't like being the only person asking for money is it can kind of feel like self-interest sometimes. And so making sure that there are also other leaders in the congregation who are shouldering some of the responsibility for talking about giving is a very healthy and good practice. And so I would encourage you know, anything you can do to find ways to involve laity in cultivating generosity and stewardship.
Also another motivation to understand people's patterns of giving, because then you can choose people who are gifted in generosity.
Very good point.
To be a part
yes.
of that.
Right.
Now, we have a comment. We need to teach that stewardship is more than financial. It's just as much as giving of ourselves in other ways, which can lead to the generosity that we are talking about. This can help those that feel they can't give as much financially to be a part of the mission. Doesn't have a question, but it is a comment that someone's left in the chat.
Well, amen. Of course, absolutely. Stewardship, a holistic concept of stewardship is about much more than just financial giving. I mean, our focus in our book is on financial stewardship, and obviously that's what we've emphasized tonight, but that doesn't take away from the fact that stewardship is about much, much more than just money. And I think that the more that we can talk holistically about stewardship, the more healthy conversation and the more healthy culture of generosity that encourages. I think that, people are very interested in things these days like environmental stewardship, and people are interested in, how they use their time. And so I think, using those things to get into a conversation about stewardship can be very, very helpful. But one thing that is also true in our faith is that it's never an either or proposition. We're not. A lot of times people think that if they give their time, they don't need to give money. In fact, God wants both our time and our treasure, and so. Acknowledging that stewardship is about more than finances doesn't mean that it's not about finances. It's about all of those things.
Amen.
And then one more comment. We are starting our stewardship campaign by taking 1 week each to review the 5 promises from the United Methodist Baptism, prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. And she says, we'll see how it works.
That's great.
Good luck. That's great. Yes.
No, it really is. I mean, I think that's a great framework.
I'd like to remind the participants that we have a couple more questions. If you have, a couple more minutes, if you have questions, type them in the chat. And I wanted to be sure and let Lovett know that after we heard his story about going to that church and not finding anything but a little pencil to write a check with, we came back and we ordered thousands of pens, and we make them available every year since then. We make pens available, and churches love pens. So if you come to West Virginia and come to one of the churches in our conference, if you don't have cash and they don't accept credit card pens, there will be a pen. There'll be a pen there, and it'll have our phone number on it.
That's great. Get rid of the golf pencils. If people take it home, just replace it. Have those envelopes there. Make them big enough that people can write something on there, and make it as easy as possible.
One mistake I made tonight, Lovett, is that I imagine there are some people that have heard me tell that story, and now they know I took it from you.
Oh, yeah. Well, I first dealt with that as a pastor, and to get rid of the golf pencils and put some that could be used for writing checks.
One of my favorite stories regarding those pens that because we give them out by the thousands, Jeff is right, is I was at a restaurant and they handed me the pen to sign the check, the bill, the credit card slip, and it was my pen that I'd ordered. It had gone, whoever,
Oh.
I don't know how, but praise be that it had gone out into the world, and that a white person in a restaurant had it to give to somebody.
Yeah,
Spread the news.
that's good.
There are no more questions in the chat unless someone puts something in there very quickly. I think we're about ready to wrap up unless there's some, no, that's a thank you. Very informative and very much appreciated. That's great.
Thank you.
And I'll add that my own thanks to Drs. Weems and Michael. This has been wonderful. And thank you to all of you who joined with us to share this time. I want to remind you of our next webinar, which will be September 29th. We'll have David Bell, who's the president of the United Methodist Foundation of Michigan, and he will speak on clergy finances. And then on November 17th, Grace Duddy Pomeroy. She's joined us before our academy. She's actually a Lutheran, but has wonderful stewardship ideas. She'll join us to talk about funding forward, finding sources of funding beyond the traditional congregational funding to resource your ministry. All of our webinars, including this one, are recorded. So you can go to umfwv.org/webinars to see the recordings and to register for upcoming webinars. And you'll be receiving an email very soon with the link to the recording for this one and resources that we hope will help you. And I'll stop and see if there's anything anyone wants to add before we close.
I was just going to
I
say.
want to
some of
thank
those-
the participants this evening for your attention, but more importantly for your work. You know, I think the people who are stewardship leaders in local congregations, you know, it's such an important work, and so I'm just grateful that you're willing to grapple with these issues and take it on, because it's really, really important.
Amen.
Some of the resources we'll be sending you in that email are provided by the kindness of Ann and Lovett. So we appreciate that. We greatly
Agree with
appreciate your
everyone.
time tonight. This has been great. Thank you.
And, you know, you can go to our website, you can find our contact information, and you can find a lot of other resources. And we're always happy to hear from people or answer questions that come to us by email. So don't hesitate to be in touch.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.